Sir, you fly the airplane, I'll fly the tower. How's that?
And when you find out who that controller was talking to like that, you'll see why this controller may have lost their entire career as an air traffic controller. Here's the full video.
B514, extend downwind to the cement, extend downwind to the Kaiser Hospital, runway 30, clear to land.
Extending downwind, clear to land 30, Bay 514. Sequencing Bay 514.
Bay 514 has been clear to land.
Roger, Bay 514.
Gotta listen. B514, you're instructed to turn base at the Kaiser Hospital.
I'm familiar with Kaiser Hospital, Bay 514.
Then why didn't you say something?
What do you want me to do, Bay 514?
You land the airplane, sir.
Just to be clear, you can't be completely rude to somebody and then add the word sir on it and then make it okay, like what he does here.
You land the airplane, sir.
This is all taking place in San Carlos Airport, which is in the Bay Area in Northern California, and I've done a lot of flying in Northern California, but I've never flown into this airport. And since the runway here is actually 2,621 feet long, they're probably not going to let me take the 747 in there anytime soon. The controller's essentially wanting the pilot to extend and fly further away from the airport and then use that hospital as a visual reference point of when to make their turn in. When the pilot checks in, he's flying on this downwind. The controller is wanting the pilot to fly further away from the airport, which is called a downwind, and then he says this.
B514, extend downwind to the cement, extend downwind to the Kaiser Hospital, runway 30, clear to land.
Essentially, what he wants this pilot to do is look out the window, see this hospital right here, and that's when he's going to make a 90-degree turn towards where he's going to have the final approach to come in and land. But listen here to what the controller says, and then what the pilot actually reads back to him.
B514, extend downwind to the cement, extend downwind to the Kaiser Hospital, runway 30, clear to land.
Extending downwind, clear to land 30, Bay 514.
So the pilot only read back, extend your downwind. Now, he should have heard about the hospital and turned there, but for whatever reason, he didn't hear it, and probably because he didn't understand it, so he didn't read it back. So the controller does have a responsibility that the read back off the instructions that they were given, that read back matches. You can't just assume like, oh, they probably know, but I think that's what happened. And then as this pilot is flying away from the airport on this extending of the downwind, he asks about the sequencing.
Sequencing Bay 514.
So he wasn't sure about what the hospital was, he didn't read it back, so he's extending this downwind now and he's asking, when do you want me to turn in? When is this sequencing going to be taking place? Because usually if you get an extended downwind, there's other planes that are going to be coming in there, and with those other planes coming in, they're going to slot you in. So he's asking, what is the sequence? Like, how much further do you want me to be flying away from the airport? And then the controller gets snarky and says this.
I'm familiar with Kaiser Hospital, Bay 514.
Then why didn't you say something?
Now, pilots, like everybody else, tend to want to do well at their job. So instead of saying, hey, I don't know where that is, or I don't understand exactly what you're telling me, sometimes they just ignore what's being said or what's happening. Now, I don't mind asking 2 or 3 times until I know exactly what's going on, but even when I was a newer pilot, I was hesitant to do that because it sounds like maybe you lack competency. But I've learned now over the years, by getting clarification, even if it annoys the controller that you're asking a 3rd time, that's better than having a violation on your record. So instead of being understanding, the controller says this.
You land the airplane, sir.
And he didn't need to say it like that because he knows at this point this pilot isn't really familiar with this area, even though based off of his call sign of Bay Flight and not a student pilot with just a regular number, he knows Bay Flight, then they're flying a plane from this area that they probably are familiar because this is their main hub where they're coming in and taking off and landing. So he figures, oh, well, he's going to know exactly when to turn in here, but obviously the pilot didn't. Instead of being polite, he starts getting snarky. But you're about to hear who else is in the plane, which is going to make this controller's day get a lot worse. Listen to this.
657, question, Bay 514, left at Delta Taxi Parking via Juliet.
Left at Delta Taxi Parking via Juliet, Bay 514.
Bay 514, ask someone in there where the Kaiser Hospital is, will you?
Roger, Bay 514.
Everyone knows where that is that flies out of here.
Let's start the training off the air, shall we?
I'm sorry, who is that?
This is the examiner on board plate 14. I'm saying let's leave the controller training off the frequency.
Sir, you fly the airplane, I'll fly the tower. How's that?
Now, this controller could have accomplished all the things that they wanted to accomplish, being that this pilot is more oriented to what's going on, and they could have done it in a much more helpful and humble way, obviously. Now, here's what I want you to understand if you're a pilot and you're ever planning to become a pilot. what you will find is you will find people like this in your career, pilots and controllers. Now, this is my own personal take on it. I don't know if this applies for this particular controller or not, but I have noticed in my experience with pilots, especially since I have more experience with that, those pilots that are real rude like that and kind of putting you down in the way that they're going to talk to you, usually it comes from their lack of confidence and competence in who they are as a pilot. That tends to be the people that are going to be the most snarky with you. So if you're having that experience, just realize that a lot of times it's their lack of confidence in who they are or how well they can do their job, and that's being reflected towards you. Just be aware of that. So if you listen to what he says here,
Baseline 14, ask someone in there where the Kaiser Hospital is, will you?
he could have simply handled it by just saying, hey, you're not in any trouble, but here's a number, give me a call, I want to talk to you real quick. And if he had said that, this would have been probably not even a video that we'd be talking about right now. The pilot would have called, obviously very nervous, because when you get a phone number to call, you know that you're about to get told by the principal that you did something wrong, but you're going to make that phone call and he's going to say, hey, listen, this is what it looks like, or this is where it's at. I didn't know that you weren't from around here, and it would have been really no big deal. That's on a recorded line as well, keep in mind. When you're talking to the tower, that's recorded. Everything's recorded, but that would have been not a big deal. That pilot would have been familiar with what's going on, and then that controller probably could have said something like, hey, ask one of the other pilots that are in there just what they look for when they're trying to find the hospital, because finding the hospital from the ground and the sky, completely different. That's how it could have happened, and it would have been a lot easier. But instead, he chose to embarrass him by saying this.
Everyone knows where that is that flies out of here.
And clearly everyone doesn't know where it is, because that guy doesn't know where it is, and I don't know where it is, and apparently the other guy, the examiner, didn't know it or didn't hear it, and it could have been because they were talking. So that examiner is what's known as a DE. Those DEs, designated examiners, are people that are given power, if you will, by the FAA to do examinations and certify people. So as a 747 pilot, when I go through my check ride, it's done by a DE. When I got all my private pilot license or instrument licenses, when you go through those, you can actually have a FAA person come and do it, or, and sometimes because it takes forever to get them to come out, there are these DEs where they're designated examiners on behalf, and they're representing the FAA when they do this. So that is who I think is in there, because if it was anybody else, they wouldn't have said, I'm an examiner. So my guess is that that is a designated examiner in there, who means he essentially represents the FAA, and that's not who you want to be messing with as a pilot or a controller. You got to be on your best behavior. And still to this day, when I go do a check ride or anytime an exam with a DE, I'm on my best behavior. They say, hey, you know, I think you should have done this. Okay, cool, yeah, I'll take that into consideration. Even if I think that they're wrong or it's just their opinion, I just go, yeah, okay, because there is a lot of work to get to that status in an aviation career. So I give them this respect that they deserve, because it is not easy to become a designated examiner, and they have a huge responsibility on them. So if somebody says that to me and they're a DE, even if I thought, well, maybe that's not true, I just go, okay, cool. Because they're not going to give you any bad advice that's going to put your life in danger or things like that, which is when I would always push back. Usually they're giving you maybe their opinions of how they think it should be done or how they think it should be done better. So I always give them that respect when they say something. This controller obviously has a different strategy for that. He hears the guy's an examiner and he says this.
Sir, you fly the airplane, I'll fly the tower. How's that?
So remember, this DE represents the FAA, and that means that he has a lot of contacts in the FAA, because if something goes wrong, he has people that he needs to go to and get information or what have you. Which means that's not the guy that you want to be messing with. Pilots tend to, this is my experience, if a controller is snappy or kind of rude, which this guy was being towards the pilot, you kind of heard that pilot just take it. And that's true even at the airlines for the most part, because pilots don't want to have the paperwork. They don't want their wings taken away. So when a controller's rude like that, they'll take it a little bit more. But when you're an examiner, you don't really have to take it, especially in this case where it's very clear. This pilot is kind of going, okay, cool, I just want to get done with this exam. And the examiners are going like, no, you're crossing the line. Don't be giving instructions while you're on the radio, because now you're jamming up the radio. The thing is, these designated examiners have a huge responsibility. So if this guy is, let's say he's doing his private pilot check ride, I don't know if that's the case, but if he is, that examiner has to watch everything that he does and say, this person is safe enough and they make good decisions, even if they mess up, which I have done on check rides. And messing up doesn't mean that you failed until you do something that's dangerous, or you violate some rule, or you break something. Well, now you failed. But even if you make a mistake, that's okay. But that examiner has to say to the FAA, I watched this person, they flew safe, and I'm confident to give them their license to do whatever this license gives them the right to do. So let's say a private pilot, now he can go fly by himself and take his buddy along as they go somewhere. So that person has that responsibility. If that guy that he says, hey, that guy's good to go fly, flies him and his buddy into a mountain, that examiner has to answer for that. And so that's why they have such a heavy responsibility on them, because it's their career on the line now. If they sign somebody off who shouldn't have been signed off and they fly themselves into a mountain, they could lose some of their licenses if something like that happens. Most of you know that JFK Jr. died when he crashed a small plane, and his examiner got questioned about it. And my guess is he got questioned a lot. Now, I flew with the designated examiner that did that private pilot check ride for JFK Jr. He gave me a check ride, and I've only failed 2 check rides in my life, and one of them was with him. And he was a great guy, but he was tough. He really wanted to make sure that I did everything well, and I did everything well on the whole check ride. I had passed, except for when I went to land, I did not land on the 1,000-foot marker. I ended up keeping in too much speed, and I floated a little bit. I didn't hit the 1,000-foot marker, and that was the end of the check ride. You know, I basically failed it. And he was really cool about it. It wasn't a big deal, but there's a standard to meet, and I didn't meet it, so that was the end of it. And while I was doing research on this, I actually looked him up just to make sure I remembered his name correctly, and I found out that he just recently passed away. John ended up giving me my license after we went up and we did a couple of landings, and it was a great experience. And what I tell people is that I've only failed 2 check rides in my whole aviation career, one with him. I learned a lot from failing, and people are scared to fail, and it sucks to fail, and nobody likes failing. I wasn't happy about it, but I said, okay, yeah, I mean, I'm supposed to land there, and I didn't land there, so that's my fault. So then I got better on power management, and you hear me talk about that a lot in my videos, and part of it comes back to that, because I blew a whole check ride, and I had to pay the examiner for that, and I have to pay the examiner to redo that whole check ride just to go up and land on those 1,000-foot markers. I had to pay another thing, and then I have a failure on my record. So obviously my condolences to John's family, but John was a great guy. And of course, I wanted to pass my check ride, and I did everything great except that last part, landing on the 1,000-foot markers. And he said, hey, you know, I'm about to bust. And he was cool about it. I mean, he was tough during the whole check ride, and I felt like I was doing bad during the whole check ride, but afterwards I realized, like, hey, I did everything right except that one little thing. So we had to go back up and do that one little thing all over again, and I learned a lot from having that failure. And now you hear me talk about how important energy management is. That's one of the examples of why it's so important, is from examples of doing things like that where I failed my check ride, but lesson learned. So now the controller who's in this tower should realize that this is a designated examiner that's in this plane, and what the implications are of having someone like that and how you talk to them on the radio. They have earned a certain amount of respect, whether you like what they're saying or don't. Sometimes you just have to give people respect for what they have accomplished in their career. This controller has a totally different plan, as you're about to hear.
Mr. Examiner, why don't, if a pilot doesn't know a command, isn't he required to ask the controller for a clarification?
You're partly blocked.
Okay, I had to pause it right here, because what's happening is, I'm guessing all the pilots that are flying and on the ground are listening to this interaction, knowing that it's going really south for this controller. And so this pilot, or I'm guessing, jumped on the radio saying partially blocked because of all the drama that's happening. And they want to hear this pilot or this controller and this examiner kind of go at it, because they know this controller is burying himself and how rude he's being. When you have someone that's like that, you kind of want to see them get buried. So this controller this pilot, by saying, hey, partially blocked, he's just pimping this controller. Say it again, so that way we can get it all on this recorded line and we can get a response from the examiner. So it's just kind of funny that he did that because of all the drama that's going on. Listen what he says.
If a pilot does not know what a controller is instructing him to do, isn't he required to ask for clarification?
Take it off air, sir.
I'm not taking anything off air. Have a good day.
This guy obviously can't control his emotions, which is not who you want flying your plane, or directing a bunch of planes. The other thing that's a big issue here is that this guy is having this conversation or argument or whatever debate with this pilot, this examiner, as well as being unnecessarily critical and saying things and jamming up the radio to this guy who's receiving the exam. He's jamming up all those waves, those radio waves. What it also means is that he's not focused on all the other planes that are going on, that are on the ground or in the sky, whatever part of the airspace he's working, but he's not focused on them. He's busy having this debate, which means somebody's not paying attention to all the other people. And what's the number one rule of every airline and FAA is safety. And this guy's not being safe in the way he's conducting himself. Regardless of how good you are at your job, regardless of how good or how bad of a pilot I am, I can't argue and have an intense argument with the other guy that I'm flying with, and then at the exact same time be like doing the best that I can while I'm flying. It's just, the reality is if you're having those emotions and having that, you're not going to perform your job really well. That's the reality. And safety has to take priority over everything else. And that's why the examiner is saying this.
Take it off air, sir.
Had that controller said, please give me a call, here's my phone number, I just want to talk about it with the examiner, or that pilot, it probably wouldn't have been a big deal. But instead, he loses his cool. That quick 5-minute phone call, not a big deal, and they could talked it out and given the opinions or whatever, and if they wanted to talk about it more or write a report, then they could have done that. But instead, he's just jamming up the radio waves and not paying attention to everybody else. And if he's working the radio, that's what he should be doing. When you make a phone call, usually what you're going to do is you're going to get covered by somebody else. Another controller is going to come there and be running everything, and then you can focus on having that phone call, not while you're running the tower or running the ground frequency. That's not the time to be doing that. So instead of keeping an eye on all the planes, he's in the tower working on his snarky comebacks.
Sir, you fly the airplane, I'll fly the tower. How's that?
So obviously this controller isn't really paying attention of what the safest way they can conduct their job is. Now, I don't know what happened. I've read some articles that said this guy got fired or got put on probation or is going to get fired, whatever it is. This guy wanted some attention and, well, he's getting it. And like I always tell you as a pilot, you want to be under the radar and have nobody know your name. Except if you're wanting to be on YouTube, but otherwise you don't want anybody to know who you are. That's true as far as a controller as well. You want to go in, do your job well, and just be left alone and not have anybody know you, know your name, because you don't want to be that person that's known. This guy, he's known now, and that's going to follow him for a while until he can prove that he can conduct himself in a way that's very professional. So he's got a black mark on his record if he's still a controller, which I don't know, and it's a lot of work to be a controller. It's not easy to do. It's a very high-stress job, and they get paid pretty well, but it's not easy, and it's definitely not for everybody. I look forward to hearing from you. Until then, keep the blue side up.